Thanks, Mike. That was a great setup. For those of you who want to look at the fine print at CED, Mike is the vice president. I am the senior vice president, which means that I am old enough to know that Studebaker was a car company. And doggone it if I had been able to convince my father to buy an Avanti and keep it, I'd be a very wealthy person today. Unfortunately, I didn't quite pull that off. We're going to have some slides for you to see at some point, and there we go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to spend just a little bit of time scaring the bejesus out of you, and then I'm going to ask you to do something. I'd like to try to move quickly so that you have a chance to ask me some questions and ask all of our panelists. But to begin with, to scare the hell out of you, let me show you a picture of what has happened to the nation's debt. The debt that the United States owes to outside lenders, shown in relationship to the size of our GDP. And this is like looking at a home mortgage relative to the income of the family. How much do you owe, and what's the income stream out of which you have to pay it? Just 3 and a fraction years ago, we were looking at that blue line. And at that time, we anticipated that the United States of America was going to hit a debt burden equal to 60% of our gross domestic product, and we consider that to be a warning light. That's the limit, was the limit for membership in the European Monetary Union until very recently when they decided they couldn't enforce it anymore. But we were going to hit 60% of our GDP in 2022. And people like me looked at that and we were frightened. We thought that was a very big problem for us to solve. First, you got to convince the American people that this is an issue that we got to be worried about. Second, you have to convince them to convince their elected representatives. Third, their elected representatives have to argue about it, decide to act, come up with policy steps to take to try to solve the problem, and those policies have got to begin to work and reduce our budget deficit and pull our accumulated debt down. So 15 years didn't seem like too much time. That was 3 years ago. What has happened since? We've moved from the blue line to the red line. For 3 years, the federal government did nothing, and the wall moved 12 years closer to us. At the end of last fiscal year, September 30th of last year, the debt held by the public equaled 62% of our GDP. So we used to have 15 years to address this problem. Those 15 years are gone. The future is now. And that's how bad it is. Let me put that in historical perspective. These are the same numbers with that highest line out there into the future. This takes you back to the end of World War II. In 1946, after all the effort that we had to put into fighting World War II, our nation had borrowed an accumulated debt of 107.8% of GDP. By the end of this decade, we'll be virtually up to that level. We'll be almost at 100% of GDP if we do not change our ways. I've had people tell me, well, hey, we've had a debt that was over 100% of GDP. We just grew out of it. So what me worry? We can just do it all again. I want you all to understand this is not your grandfather's economy. We are not positioned for the kind of economic growth that we had at the end of World War II for lots and lots of reasons. We don't have troops coming home to make our labor force bigger so that we can produce more. Instead, we have geezers like me retiring so that the labor force is smaller and we're going to be producing less. The rest of the world has not been flattened by the World War II effort, such that if they want to buy anything, the one place they can go is the United States. Instead, the rest of the world is developing rapidly and is intensely competing with us for export business. We do not have factories that are sitting waiting to be converted from wartime to peacetime production. Instead, we've got factories that we're shuttering because we do not have consumer demand. And why don't we have consumer demand? A substantial reason for that is consumer balance sheets have been hit hard by the financial slowdown at the end of the last decade and the decline in home values. Look back to the end of World War II. You had families that, because of rationing and because consumer goods like homes, automobiles, refrigerators were simply not available because we were producing flat out for the war effort, those households had incomes they couldn't spend. So back then, family balance sheets were not depleted. They were rather very fat. At the end of the war, people wanted to spend. They had the money to spend. We had the workers coming home to produce the stuff they wanted. We had demand for our exports. We were perfectly situated for rapid economic growth. We are not going to replicate the situation that you can see there on the chart. This time, we are not going to be able to grow our way out of the problem. We're going to have to dig our way out of the problem. We're going to have to work our way out of it. Interest rates right now are very low. The reasons are twofold. Number one, the economy is very weak. There's not much demand for credit. Home sales are way down. Automobile sales are lower than we like them to be, so consumers aren't borrowing. Businesses don't have to borrow because they've got idle factories and machines. They don't need to do new investment. They're hoping that they'll get enough sales so that they can use the investment they've already made. So the Federal Reserve then has lowered interest rates to try to stimulate the economy. These are the teaser rates, if you will, at which the federal government is borrowing. For example, this year the deficit is projected to be another $1.5 trillion. So we're borrowing at these very low interest rates. We hope that the economy recovers, and we hope that when the economy recovers, the natural result is going to be that interest rates are going to go up. But think about what that implies. Right now, if you look at that chart, you can see a federal funds rate, a 3-month Treasury bill rate, which is very nearly equal to it, that is running less than 0.25% as an annualized yield. In good times, normally we expect the federal funds rate and the Treasury bill rate to be more on the order of 4%. Put those two numbers together. The cost of servicing every U.S. Treasury bill is going to increase by a factor of 16, from 0.25% per year to 4% per year. Long-term interest rates could very well increase by half, if not more. And these are just normal good times rates. This is not assuming that things get out of hand. Last year, the federal government spent $200 billion to service its debt. If we keep on going in the direction we're going right now, 10 years from now, that cost will not be $200 billion. It will be $1 trillion, 5 times more. And all of that is going to add to the federal government spending. And incidentally, you don't get anything for paying interest on the debt. It doesn't buy you highways. It doesn't buy you air traffic safety. It doesn't buy you national defense. That's money you spend for which you get absolutely nothing in return. Why are we going to have a problem when our debt continues, if our debt continues to rise and we don't take action? Here are a couple things to keep in mind. The federal debt matures at a very rapid rate. At any given time, about 1/3 of our debt will mature within the next 1 year. That includes the 3-month Treasury bills that I mentioned to you earlier. It includes longer-term securities that have come to the end of their run. So if interest rates start to rise, the federal government's interest bill will increase very rapidly as the debt begins to turn over. You'll see on the chart there that another 1/3 of the debt matures between 1 year and 5 years. So it doesn't take much time, if interest rates begin to rise, for the federal government's debt service cost to increase very rapidly. Now, why do we have to worry about interest rates rising beyond the normal concerns that we got low interest rates now, and if the economy grows, we're going to get back up to more normal levels? We borrow a substantial part of our money from overseas, more than half, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. If all those foreign lenders come to the conclusion that the United States is not a reliable borrower, if they don't feel as comfortable as they are right now about receiving interest payments on their loans, they're going to start to demand higher interest rates in the marketplace. How reliable are we? This chart shows you the U.S. debt burden relative to the rest of the countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. These are the 30 major developed countries around the world. The United States has the 8th highest debt burden of all of these countries. The 7 countries that have higher debt burdens than the United States are all in trouble. They include Portugal and Greece and Iceland. At the extreme on the far side, you see the very tall bar, that's Japan. The United States debt burden, and this has to include state and local governments as well because you have to have apples-to-apples comparisons across countries. The United States, by that measure, is over 90%. Japan's debt burden is 200% of its GDP. So how does Japan get away with it? Japan gets away with it because Japanese households buy all the debt. 95% of Japan's debt is financed domestically by Japanese investors. The United States picture is very different. Of the more than $5 trillion of debt that the United States had to sell over the last 10 years to raise cash for the federal government to operate, more than $3 trillion, or about 60% of it, was sold to foreign investors. We financed only about $2 trillion of that domestically. So Japan can get away with a higher debt burden than we can because they finance their own debt. They save money and give it to the government so that the government can meet its obligations. Here in the United States, we go abroad to raise the money that we need for the federal government to operate. Why is that risky? Foreign investors are inherently a little bit less reliable as financiers of the federal government. At least one reason is very simple. If you're from overseas, you have to consider not just the prospects for the Treasury security that you're buying, not just the yield and the possible changes in the price. You also have to consider changes in the value of the dollar relative to your currency. So if prices of currencies move in an adverse way, you can lose even more money than if the value of your securities moves. If we have a crisis here in the United States, if the rest of the world decides that we are not a reliable borrower, people become concerned that the prices of Treasury securities are going to fall, yields are going to rise. They become concerned that if that happens, the value of the dollar is going to fall. It's a little bit like having someone yell fire in a crowded theater. You do not expect people to get up and walk in neat, orderly lines for the exits if somebody yells fire. Likewise, if investors in financial markets see the values of their securities going down, they're going to try to get out. And they're all going to try to get out at once, and it's not going to be pretty. And the result of that will be even higher interest rates and even higher debt service costs for the United States. Think about that. A falling dollar, rising prices for everything we buy overseas, including the inputs for businesses who are producing here, using imports for part of the production process. They're going to have to pay more. So the effect of that is to have faster inflation. We all know that U.S. households do not like inflation. At the same time, with higher interest rates, all the small businesses out there who have had to finance their operations with variable rate loans could find the cost of servicing their debts grow by multiples, just the same way that the cost of servicing the federal debt could grow.